Welcome to the Sound Advice podcast. We are Citizens Advice North East Derbyshire. We focus on providing advice for people within the North East Derbyshire and Bolsover district and want to do just that with our podcast. Enjoy!
Hello, this is Sound Advice, and I'm joined this week by Chelsea and Steve. Steve's one of our debt colleagues. His job in the debt team is to provide specialist advice to people with debts, to assess the situation that they're in, to provide advice on the options and solutions, and to progress them through that. So thank you both for joining us again. This week we're going to be looking at what sort of issues we face as advisors, what sort of questions you might have as members of the public, and what support we can give and where you can get extra sources of help if you need it. One of the issues that a lot of people might be having is, are there any indicators that someone is in debt? What do you see as advisors that says to you, this client has got an issue that they need advice about?
Our clients often come when they have problems with, it can be as harsh as bailiffs. So they've got to a point where their debts are getting out of control. There are earlier signs than that probably clients ignore. And a lot of us have been there, whereby you have envelopes, you know it's a bill and you don't open it. And so you start to bury your head in the sand and start to ignore the debts that are accumulating, maybe through no fault of your own. And with that, we also find that there's a difficulty with mental health. So people can get very depressed and down about their debts. But I think the first point to make is that it's never out of control. There's always things that they can do, and they have to try and seek some help and get some assistance as to how to manage their debts.
That leads quite nicely on to another question I had. How can someone stop putting off sorting out their money issues? Because like you say, it can be quite overwhelming and quite easy to kind of push aside and ignore.
Yeah, probably the easiest thing that they can do is talk to the people who they owe money to. So we find that the clients that we have who take the step to talk to their creditor, whoever they owe money to, they're often surprised how friendly and helpful that they are. And for 90% of the time, I think that's absolutely the case. What starts to make the debts unmanageable is when they don't communicate. And so talking to your creditors, give them some idea of where you are, what's happening in your life, and they will come up with some options. And of course, one of those options will be to talk to Citizens Advice or a charity that gives free debt advice. We have two classes of debt. When we have a client who presents a debt problem to us, the first thing we do is we work out which are the priority debts and which are the non-priority debts. Priority debts are the ones where effectively enforcement action is more severe. And so if for example we look at council tax can be quite quick to turn into bailiff action, and nobody wants somebody turning up at their door demanding money. We have gas and electricity, which is a priority debt. They have the power to disconnect the gas electricity supply. I'll stress that it rarely happens, but that power is there and it can't be ignored. Rent, of course, is another one where if you get behind with your rent, then you're in danger of eviction. And also TV license as well, where on paper it actually carries a prison sentence, but it's incredibly rare. There are only a few people each year who are actually imprisoned for not paying their TV license, but it's enough for us to treat it as a priority debt. There are others which I won't bore you with, but basically they're the key ones that we see. And outside of the priority debts, we have non-priority debts, which is the ones that people are probably as much as concerned about, which are credit cards, loans, overdrafts. But actually the range of enforcement that a creditor can do is actually not that great, and so there's less to be concerned about with those. So when we're presented with clients who has debts, we'll divide them into those two categories of debt and immediately deal with the priorities to make sure that they're under control.
It's interesting talking about the non-priority aspect of it. I mean, it's easy to understand what you say about priority debts because with the possible exception of the television licence, those are all things really associated with maintaining life. So your rent and your council tax, keeping up your standard of living and things like that. Is it sometimes difficult to persuade clients of the difference between what they should be treating as a priority or not?
It is, and part of it is about them, not actually knowing. And very often we see clients who are actually paying a non-priority debt rather than a priority, and so they will be trying really hard to keep up the minimum payments on a credit card, but they've stopped paying their council tax, which is the opposite of what they should be doing. We have lots more scope for dealing with a non-priority debt and making life easier for the client. But with council tax arrears, for example, we've only got limited things that we can do. There's an element of not knowing, and there is also something about people wanting to actually, or trying to protect their credit rating as well, which also puts pressure on them to keep up payments on non-priority and ignore the priority. So, for example, rent and your gas, electricity.
It's interesting you should mention the credit reports as well and the credit rating, because I know Chelsea was discussing this a few weeks ago with us. What impact does this sort of issue have on a credit rating, and is it important, do you think, in the long run?
It's more about being important to the client. A lot of our clients are concerned about how their credit rating will be affected. And what we see on credit reports are the gas, electricity, and so on. But interestingly, it's rare that we actually see rent on there. And council tax is not on a credit report. And so to some extent, a client, everybody can get access to their credit reports online, and they see which ones are actually showing on their credit reports. And again, it's a pressure on them to probably pay their non-priorities and not worry so much about those which aren't showing, which are actually the priorities. Rent and council tax are top of the list for the bills that they should be paying. So I think there is a growing pressure for people to actually pay more attention to their credit rating than they probably should. And credit ratings are there to work out lendability and whether a creditor should actually lend to them. And there is a sort of an argument that actually if you are struggling to pay your priorities, then you probably shouldn't be looking for lines of credit. So there's a balance to be had there, but we certainly respect if a client wants to try and protect their credit rating.
What is the best way to reduce the likelihood of someone falling into debt? Is there a specific way to stop it?
Yeah, after my experience of debt advice and clients is that the thing that I wish there was more of is more awareness of how to budget. And just those basic budgeting skills, I think, would really help people. I suppose it's no longer surprising to us, but when we first sit in front of a client and we, ask them about their income and expenditure, and then we briefly discuss it, and we'll send them their budget sheet, and we'll show them how much they're getting and how much they're spending. And the majority of our clients are completely unaware as to whether they have any spare money at the end of the month. They are just getting by, and they're trying to not pay one debt 1 month, and then they'll maybe pay a little bit off next month. But overall, their income is not big enough to pay all of their outgoings. And so I think budgeting is probably one of the best skills that somebody can actually do. And there are sort of like tools available to help people do that. On the National Deadline website there is a budgeting tool, and also we have a tool called Cab Money, which will help somebody draw up a income expenditure, and so they'll get some idea of where they are and whether they can actually afford all of their commitments or not.
It's worth mentioning as well that you don't have to be in debt to budget for yourself, do you? I mean, it's good practice. I'm sure, Chelsea, if you've got your income and expenditure, you need to know what's coming and going out. Is there a way that you can do that is simple? I mean, you've talked about it being a specialist skill in terms of looking at what's coming and going out. Does it need specialist advice? Is it something that they can look at? Does it just need a degree of honesty about what you're doing with your money?
Yeah, I think it's that there is possibly a little bit of honesty, but it never harms to actually sit down with somebody, whether they're a debt advisor or your partner or your friends or parents, and actually listen when they say, you've forgotten this, what about that, and as debt advisors we allow, for example, a certain amount for gifts and for Christmas and so on, and they're easy to overlook, and they're just things that happen at the end of the year. But what we try and do is we try to capture all of those things, the possibility or maybe the certainty that your car is going to break down sometime in the year, and therefore allow something each month for putting it right and making an allowance for that each month. So yeah, you just need a certain amount of honesty, but it's a good idea to sit down with somebody and just sort of like throw ideas around about where the money might be going. It could be that sort of like walk into work where you buy that £3 coffee on the way in each day, which you've not actually budgeted for, but it's a £60 a month expenditure.
Since working from home, I've made a massive saving on not going for a coffee at the end of the working day or on my way in.
Yeah.
And now I wonder where all this extra money's come from. So yeah.
In terms of money management, where would you say is the best place to save money in terms of interest rates? Or I know some places have long-term rules about withdrawing the money that you've saved too early, or...
Yeah, as debt advisors, we're not allowed to actually give any financial advice. So it is something that we shy away from. I think what is safe to say is that at the moment, the interest rates that are out there are incredibly low. And so nobody is really going to be making vast amounts of money. So it's not about where, it's about the why. And if you know, for example, that you should be putting so much away for Christmas, so much away for that MOT for the car that's coming up in 6 months' time, then it's more important about knowing, why you're saving, and have a rule of thumb as to how much you're saving, and then make sure that you can get it, very easily, so that you've got it when you want it and it's not tied up. But I would emphasize that it's important to actually have some savings to fall back on. And our clients, when they get to us, their credit ratings are quite low, and therefore their lines of credit are very poor. And so it makes it even more important that they have a little bit of a small amount of savings to fall back on. The government guidelines are you should have something along the lines of 1 month's outgoings available as savings. Incredibly rare that we come across somebody who has that level of savings, and even people in good jobs may not have that amount of savings. So I think it's more about the understanding why you need to, and then making best efforts to save as much as you can for that proverbial rainy day.
That's where the budgeting comes into its own, isn't it, in terms of building things in to accrue those savings?
Absolutely, yeah.
Of course, I suppose the clients that we see quite often are in situations where their income doesn't allow it, and they are living on the breadline themselves already, aren't they?
And that's the thing, is that we will never judge a client for not having saved, because a lot of them are on low incomes. They could be on benefits, and there just simply isn't enough there to actually meet their outgoings, and that's the reason why they're in debt. And so their ability to save went a while ago. It's that point has passed. But hopefully once we get to the end of the debt process, the debt counselling that we do, that they will understand that it's important to actually save in order to budget, and therefore avoid a repetition of the debt which they've presented to us.
I think what I've realised in this last year is just what a knife edge people who are seemingly in quite well-paid jobs. It just takes a small change, such as the furlough scheme.
Yeah.
People having a reduction in their income or redundancy, and it all comes crashing down, doesn't it?
I agree, yeah. And we're all in that sort of situation. Anybody who takes a 20-30% reduction in income, which is has been very common over the last year, that's a massive hit to take. So it's not surprising that a lot of people are actually finding that they're struggling and can't pay all of their outgoings.
If someone is struggling with debt and struggling to pay it off, is there a possibility of getting it written off by speaking with the people who you owe money to, or?
There are ways of writing it off, and of course it really depends upon the individual's circumstances, but we can actually request on a client's behalf that a debt is written off, but that inevitably has to be backed up by medical evidence. And I have to say that creditors are not overly keen to write debts off, but it's done every year. Every year we have probably a substantial amount of money written off. It's just that we struggle to get all debts sort of written off that have a case for being written off. A debt can also be questioned and potentially written off if there is a possibility of irresponsible lending. If the loan credit card was taken out when that person was clearly unable to pay that amount, that level of credit, then there is a question about irresponsible lending. And so there are avenues that we can go down there. We've also got the formal insolvency solutions as well. And basically somebody is insolvent if they can no longer afford to pay their debts. That's the broad brush stroke. But if somebody's income is not sufficient for them to be able to pay their debts, then they are technically insolvent, and therefore options open up there that we can do. One that everybody's sort of like heard of is bankruptcy, but there are smaller scale options such as a debt relief order. A debt relief order will allow somebody to write off the debt if they are seen to be insolvent, and it's an affordable option for people, and it gives them an opportunity for a fresh start, wipe the slate clean and move on with your life. It gives an amazing boost to their mental health as well, because they're able to effectively start again and start living. And as I say, we can also make requests to actually write the debt off as well. There's a whole wealth of debt options that we can look at for a client. And so I suppose we come back to the seeking help, talk to a debt advisor and find out what options would work for that individual.
You mentioned words like bankruptcy and insolvency, and to be honest, they could be terrifying, couldn't they? I mean, should people be afraid of things like that?
Not at all. It's not something that you should take lightly, and you have to have a certain level of debt. So if you owe, say, a couple of £100, there are better ways of actually dealing with the debt. But if you've got debts that on paper it's going to take you, for example, 50 years to pay off, then you're actually better off doing an insolvency option and to wipe the debt out. There isn't any social stigma associated with bankruptcy now as probably there used to be. And in fact, the government acknowledges that insolvency and writing off debt is actually a healthy thing for the economics of a society, because it allows people to get back out there, ironically, buying things, spending, and keeping the economy healthy, because they are participants in buying things, renting things and so on, which is good for the UK. So yeah, there's nothing to be worried about really.
I think that's a worthwhile point to make because the stigma is still there around debt, isn't it? And in my opinion and in my experience, that has been a barrier to people getting advice. Is there anything that you could say to people to try and break that barrier down?
I think the first thing is possibly acknowledging to yourself that you've got debt that is starting to become unmanageable. But everybody, debt professionals, I include the creditors in there, who when you talk to your credit card or your lender or whatever, they've heard it all before. They deal with it on a day-to-day basis, and they're not shocked, they're not surprised, they're not judgmental. They're there to just help. And it can be a little bit scary making that step, but I wish I had that proverbial pound for everybody who says to me, I'll be able to sleep tonight now, because they've shared their difficulties and they found that there are things that can be done.
Even at the first contact, I've quite often had clients who have said it's a weight off my shoulders just to be able to see that there is a way forward.
Yeah.
And that's before we've got into the in-depth aspect of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And as you know, Ben, part of the process of debt counselling is that we find opportunities to maximise income. And so even before you've started to sort of like think about debt options, there might actually be unclaimed benefits that they can take. Another aspect is minimising outgoings. So there might be things there that they really don't need and they didn't actually realise that they were paying for. I had a lady about 2 weeks ago, on the basis of our debt options meeting, she'd found about £70 a month that she realised that she was paying out, and she didn't need to. It was, for insurances that were no longer valid. She was paying for her credit reports. Ironically, she was paying for credit reports but wasn't able to pay for her full council tax. So all of this sort of like minimising outgoings, maximising your income, it all helps. And yeah, that's even before we've started to discuss options for dealing with debt.
Yeah, it's worth making the point that quite often there are extra sources of income that we can look at, or short-term stopgaps while we can get some support. It might mean a referral to a food bank, it might mean charitable support to put money on your gas and electricity, but that's what those things are there for, isn't it? To provide that emergency support while you do get things into a better perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And after a debt session, it could be that we've identified charitable applications that they can do. I mean, for example, anybody who is ex-armed forces, there's a lot of support out there for them if they find that they're in financial difficulties, and they just have to ask and they can get some help.
I think one thing worth mentioning is there's a lot of talk about student debts. Obviously, it is a big issue. Do you think students should be as worried about their student loan accounts as we hear that they are?
Not at all. It's arguably not a debt. It's certainly a debt that we're not allowed to write off, but it's probably quite rare that somebody who has a student loan will actually pay it all off anyway. So it's not really a debt that people should be concerned about. And thankfully, I mean, it's in a way it's an ideal debt, because we find that, of course, somebody who is suddenly going on to sort of like benefits through no fault of their own, loss of income, with a student loan, it's automatically understood that they don't have to pay it. Wouldn't it be great if all debts were as good as student loans? So no, student loans are not something that somebody should be intimidated by, really.
I think Martin Lewis has quite a good way of analogising it in terms of referring to it as more of a tax on graduates, isn't he? That the theoretical debt is there, but it's only paid according to what you earn as a graduate.
Absolutely. And it should never get in the way of somebody deciding to take up, higher education. Yeah, you can kick it down the road and worry about it after graduation, but yeah.
Does it show on credit reports?
No, No, it doesn't. I think that's the other thing. I mean, going back to sort of like credit reports, not all debts do show up on credit reports. Credit reports are actually a voluntary thing, so the creditors have to actually send the information on the debt to a credit report agency, and if they don't actually do that, then it's not actually listed there. So a credit report is an inaccurate beast anyway, but no, student loans are not on there.
So there again, it's not going to have an impact on your future ability to take a mortgage out,
No.
get further credit, is it?
No. We would obviously consider it with budgeting, and so it's again something that we would need to know about when working out income expenditure and therefore affordability or insolvency. But no, it's not an important factor.
I think one other thing that's worth mentioning is you've said the best advice is to get advice. Is all debt advice created equally?
No, if we have any sort of like bugbears and things that we're happy to whinge about, is that if you put debt in a search engine, you will be inundated by advertisements. So your Google search will come up with lots of results with the little sign of ad next to it, which usually means that somebody is looking to make a profit out of somebody's debt. And so if you are looking for help and advice with your debt, go for someone that is a charity and a non-profit making organization, or else you are highly unlikely to get impartial advice.
I'm sure we've all seen those adverts on Facebook that promise to write off up to however much percentage of our debt. So are you saying steer clear of that?
Yeah, I certainly would, because they are looking to make a large amount of profit from the person who can least afford to pay it, and they have a bias towards one particular debt option, and they are willing to overlook more appropriate solutions because it means that they wouldn't actually make any money out of it. So yeah, it could be that the product that organization is selling, it might be the best option for them, but it should be about choice and understanding what all of your options are before committing to give a particular company, say, 70, £150 a month, that you may find quickly that you just cannot sustain. So yeah, make sure that you get impartial, free advice from an organisation that has no vested interest in which debt option that might be appropriate to you.
Yeah, it's really worthwhile knowing, isn't it?
Definitely.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's a really broad-ranging subject, and I know we've touched on quite a lot of different aspects of debt and money management, and we could go on for quite a long time, but thank you for joining us. I think what I'm going to take away is to try and put in my mind as well, it's good to take away from me managing my own budget, because there again, like you said, we spend money not knowing or not having budgeted for it. We go into Costa or wherever we buy a coffee and we do that regularly. It mounts up, doesn't it? So
it does, yeah. Some very good advice I got from a bank manager who wasn't actually acting in a professional capacity. I'd met him in the pub, and the observation he made was that we spend over 40 hours a week earning our money, but we spend precious little time trying to manage it. And it was an interesting observation that I've never forgotten.
It is. It's the elephant in the room, so to speak, isn't it? That
absolutely.
We work very hard for what we've got coming in, and then it just disappears like water through your fingers.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of coming back, and if anything, sort of like comes out of this broadcast, is that I'd like people to, come forward and talk about their debts, and they'll be treated with respect, non-judgmentally, with dignity, and we're there to help. And it might be that, we just give advice and that's it. We can maybe help you get to a point where we can write the debt off. But the first step is to acknowledge that you've got problem debt and come forward and start talking to us.
Even if you haven't got that problem debt, I would still say if you've got any concerns about how you're managing it, if your income is decreasing, if you think you're concerned about rising expenditures, we can have a look at aspects to increase your income, to maximise what you've got to spend, to look at issues around the best tariffs on your utilities. That can all have an impact on what you've got. So the prevention is always better than the cure, isn't it? But
absolutely,
like you say, our service is non-judgmental, it is independent, and hopefully we always treat people with the respect that they deserve when they come to see us.
Absolutely.
I thank you both for joining me this week.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you want to look for any further information about any of the issues that we've discussed today, you can visit cabmoney.org.uk. That's the resource that Steve talked about for details about the debt options, information on how to deal with creditors and bailiffs, and it's also got the budgeting tool that we mentioned. You can visit nationaldebtline.org.uk or citizensadvice.org.uk. Both of those are free to use services, and both of those have options for you to call a helpline to get more in-depth advice depending on your issue and whether you want to approach someone. Got any questions, or if you want to give us any feedback or ideas for future areas to discuss, please feel free to get in touch with us at soundadvice@nedcab.org.uk. We're more than willing to listen to any feedback that you've got to give. But other than that, thank you very much for listening.